Was the Mercedes 140 turbo diesel underappreciated? You can probably say, going back and looking at my videos, that I'm not a big fan of the W140. And not much has changed. But I do have a lot of appreciation for the 603.971 engine. And that was the engine that was used in the 1992 and 93 300 SD and the 94 and 95 S350. After the production of those engines ended, Mercedes still kept making a turbo diesel 140 for the rest of the world, and they called it the S300. And it used the OM606 turbo diesel that was also used in the E300. Why they did not send that car to the United States, I don't understand. I think it's absolutely ludicrous because that car had enough power and was, you know, for all intents and purposes, it did everything so well that there's no reason why it shouldn't have come here. But alas, history is usually dictated by bureaucrats, and I'm sure there was a bureaucratic reason for what happened. So we're going to look at the 300 SD and its successor, the S350. We're going to look at some of the issues they had, and we're going to determine if those cars were actually good cars or not. The S350 was the final combination of this big 603 turbo diesel 3.5 liter engine. It went out with 148 horsepower, which is not that much on paper, but for a diesel engine with well over 200 foot-pounds of torque, the car's performance was more than adequate. They were extremely quiet, and they got 22 to 25 miles per gallon, depending on how you drove. And much like their predecessors, they had managed to refrain from using extensive electronics to make the engine run. So this was kind of a big deal that it was still an analog engine. This was, along with the 95 E300, the last analog Mercedes diesel. And sometimes I find it really fascinating. I forget that the E300, which came out in 95, was not the only diesel Mercedes offered to the US market. Now, in 92 and 93, the 300 SD was sold alongside the 300D 2.5 turbo. In 94, when you technically could buy an E300, if you wanted a Mercedes diesel in 94, you had to buy the S350 because it was technically the only 94 model year diesel. These cars were famous for rod failures. I know some of you were waiting for me to say that, oh, when's Pierre going to say the thing about the connecting rod failures? But they had some other issues too. Their other issues included leaking valve guides. Some of their other issues included problems that were endemic to the 140, such as evaporator issues, which, because of the subtle diesel vibrations, I think the evaporators on these cars had a tendency to fail sooner. And of course, we're in an era where the complicated electronics of the W140 now present something of a headache for those that are unfamiliar with them. I have never found the 140 to be everything that Mercedes hoped it would be. This was sort of like, if Mercedes had done the 140 right, they would have made a leaner, lighter, sportier, easier to service S-Class, a car that had more in common with the 126 than it did with a Hindenburg. But the 140 is what we got, and the cars do have some attributes. They're extremely quiet. They do get relatively good fuel economy for how big they are. They can transport just about anyone or anything, especially if you have a 5 or 6 liter V12 in total silence. But what about the diesel? Is the diesel worth the trouble? This is a toss-up, because if you like the 140 and you're tired of dealing with complicated electronic diagnostics on your engine, which you'd have to deal with on a 119 or an M120, you probably would appreciate the diesel. However, on the 140 chassis, because of other problems with the car, especially as they age, you're still going to have to put up with things like body control modules or interior parts being no longer available if the car that you acquired has 250,000 miles on it. Still, I think in 20 years when we do an inventory of surviving 140s, there will be a reasonably high number of these cars left because they are analog and they do always run. Despite what people say about the connecting rod issues, we find that those connecting rod issues were only present on a small percentage of the cars when they were relatively new. In other words, if it survived this long, you can probably keep enjoying it for a few more years without any major issues. Now, you may run into head gasket issues or valve guide issues, and those are different. Those are wear related, but the rods, sort of, I guess what I'm saying, are either they failed or they didn't, unless you forget to put oil in your car. Now let's look at some values of these cars. I've seen recently that some of these cars have started to sell for over $10,000, $15,000, even $20,000 for really great examples. Are they worth this kind of money? I can say that the appreciation curve sounds a lot like the one for the 350 SD or the 350 SDL. But the 350 and SD and SDL were really helped by the fact that they were 126s. The 140 is a niche car. People I know who love them really love them, and people I know who don't usually had a bad experience with them, and it often was not an invalid one. I know people that have driven hundreds of thousands of highway miles in the 140, and that's the reason they like it so much. And so perhaps this is where the diesel comes in. Because if there's nothing eternally wrong with the engines, the powertrains are extremely reliable. And they make great highway cars. If you're a super commuter and you have to commute over 200 miles a day for work, these cars are still a good consideration as long as you change the oil at 2,500 miles and you stay on top of any weird oil leaks, diesel leaks, or oil consumption issues. These can include failures of the turbo or leaks from the injection pump, to name a few. It also helps to update the vacuum pump so the timing chain doesn't break. So my conclusion about these cars is they offer some redeeming value to the 140 chassis. Not that I'm saying that the 140 is the worst car Mercedes ever made. I'm still not sure which car to give that to because I have so many choices, but I think it goes to the CLA. But I am saying that the diesel, strangely in a way, bolsters the legitimacy of the W140. Makes the 140 seem more like a real Mercedes because, let's face it, real Mercedes sedans, at least, they don't have to be sports cars, but real Mercedes sedans had diesel engines. If Mercedes didn't offer a diesel, it's sort of how delegitimizes the platform itself, and maybe that's one reason why these cars have survived so well, because they're still iconic in a way, retaining an analog Mercedes turbo diesel engine under the hood, even if very few examples were sold. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have a 140 turbo diesel, take good care of it because it's still better than trying to find your way through a bunch of shorted wiring harnesses on a 93 S600.